Welcome to EssentialCSLewis.com. I'm William O'Flaherty. What follows is from the archives of my podcast that was first released in 2013, but made available here for the first time. It is the initial show of a miniseries on the Chronicles of Narnia, where just one episode was done for each book. As this is released in 2025, it is the 75th anniversary of when The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was the first published story. For each show, I had a different featured guest, and in almost all of them, I had two co-hosts. They were Dr. Crystal Hurd, host of That Lewis Lady YouTube channel, and Paul Martin from NarniaFans.com. For this show on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the special guest was the late Dr. Bruce Edwards. As you'll hear in a moment, there were 5 common segments to this miniseries. Now, here's a slightly edited version of the original recording from 2013. Joining me from NarniaFans.com is Paul Martin. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks. Hello, everybody.
Also sharing co-hosting duties with me is Dr. Crystal Hurd, who is an educator and researcher from Virginia. Welcome to the first episode, Crystal.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
But wait, there is more. For each of our shows, we have a different special guest. For this premiere program, Dr. Bruce Edwards, author of several books about C.S. Lewis, joins us. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Glad to be here.
Several books that he has authored are Not a Tame Lion, The Spiritual World of Narnia, and further up and further in, Understanding C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Both books are from 2005. And then he edited a 4-volume encyclopedia called C.S. Lewis, Life, Works, and Legacy. In a moment, we'll begin with looking at the story behind the story, which will be a feature for each of the books that we look at with our special guest. However, since this is the first show, one of the things to note is the reading order of the Chronicles of Narnia books. There's something, if you're not familiar, called the publication order versus the chronological order. Paul, since you do NarniaFans.com, which we'll have you elaborate on in a later segment, tell us about the difference there between the publication versus the chronological and what you prefer or recommend.
The original publication order actually started with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in 1950, followed by Prince Caspian, then Voyage of the Dawn Treader, then The Silver Chair, then The Horse and His Boy, and finally The Magician's Nephew and The Last Battle. That is actually the order that I prefer. It is the order in which I read the books for the first time, and it is the order that maintains the mystery and the magic of the wardrobe and the lamppost and entering Narnia without revealing where they came from until much later in the series. Later on, they changed the order into what is chronological order, which is semi-chronological, starting with Magician's Nephew, then going into The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And during the timeline of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you're going to read it chronologically, before the hunt for the white stag, you'd have to cut in for the horse and his boy, and then finally finish The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, followed by Prince Caspian, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair, and The Last Battle. In that order, everything takes place from the beginning of Narnia to the end of Narnia.
The whole reason for having The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as the first in the series of this special podcast is because it was the first one that was published. Now let's consider the story behind the story. This is a feature that we'll do for each of the books. Again, for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the first one. And Bruce, give us some of the background information that's interesting about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
What's compelling to me at this stage of, I've been reading Lewis for 40 years, and it's the freedom that Lewis finally experiences in the late 40s to come back to a theme or a picture or an image or a dream in his mind that he's carried around since, as he says, he was 16 years old. So whether we're thinking of the faun with the umbrella and the gifts he's bearing, or we're thinking of his dreams about lions, and it rekindles these images that we now know are Aslan. it's an interesting era for Lewis, and it's just about before he engages in a correspondence and then a series of visits with Joy Davidman. He's at the end of an era of polemics, of public battle over Christian themes and issues. And he gets to return to a childlike and childhood love of children's literature, now baptized, as we might say, using the language he used for George MacDonald, who baptized his imagination. We now get to see Lewis come into fullness with what he really wants to do. And this last decade or so of his life is really focused on narrative. And that's what makes, I think, Narnia so successful and so terrifically realized in Lewis's universe, and especially a benefit to his readers, whether children or adults. And it just gives him this freedom of expression that he's really not had since he entered upon this public apologist role that he took on of necessity, I think, because he didn't find anyone else doing that job.
Now it's time for a segment we call the short summary of the story that we're discussing. To remind you as a listener, if you maybe haven't read the story in a while, or you're not sure if you want to read it, or you've watched the movie, if there was a movie version out, there is obviously for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is one of Lewis's most beloved works. The story is set during the political turbulence and bombings of World War II. 4 siblings, Peter, Edmund, Susan, and Lucy, are moved to the country residence of an old professor whose house is full of old relics, which fascinates the children and provokes curiosity. The youngest girl, Lucy, decides to explore the house and stumbles into a room with only an old wardrobe. Lucy opens the wardrobe and soon discovers the land of Narnia, where she meets the gentle fawn Mr. Tumnus, carrying packages through the snow by a lamppost. Tumnus takes her to his home and entertains her until she drifts off to sleep. When she wakes, Mr. Tumnus reveals that he was intending to turn her in to the White Witch, who demands to know if any citizen of Narnia has had an encounter with humans. Lucy makes her way back through the wardrobe and enthusiastically tells her siblings about discovering Narnia. Unfortunately, her brothers and sister refuse to believe the story. That is, until her skeptical brother Edmund goes into the wardrobe after Lucy and finds Narnia too. Once there, he encounters the White Witch, who entices him with Turkish delight, hot chocolate, and hopes of becoming Prince of Narnia. When he returns back through the wardrobe, he denies the visit, much to the dismay of Lucy. However, all the children end up hiding in the wardrobe and discovering Narnia. Lucy leads the group until they find Mr. Beaver. Mr. Beaver invites the children back to his home and informs them about a great lion named Aslan who offers hope to Narnian animals oppressed by the White Witch. During this visit, Edmund sneaks off to find the White Witch's palace and becomes her prisoner. The other 3 siblings meet Aslan and, with their special gifts from Father Christmas, aim to restore peace to Narnia. The White Witch presents her claim to kill Edmund, but Aslan negotiates with her for Edmund's freedom and in return is slain on the stone table in Edmund's place, as Susan and Lucy tearfully look on. However, soon the great magic resurrects Aslan and he rushes to assist Peter and Edmund conquer the witch and her army. But Aslan has assembled an army of his own, created from creatures in Narnia and including animals that were previously cast to stone by the witch. The witch and her army are defeated, and the 4 children become kings and queens of Narnia, as the old prophecy predicted. For many Narnian years, the children reign happily. Upon hunting a white stag, they come upon the lamppost, which stirs their curiosity. Once they explore the wood around the post, they find themselves coming back through the wardrobe and returning to their previous lives. And that's the story.
Our next segment, we'll be looking at favorite characters. Paul Martin will be leading us in that discussion.
Let's start going into our favorite characters from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I think I'll start, with a couple of my favorite characters, 2 of which I think they're very different characters from each other, but also they say a lot about, the journey that we take into Narnia, as well as the journey that other characters take throughout. And I would say that would be for me Lucy and Mr. Tumnus, both of which are a kind of iconic characters. They're two of the first characters that you really come to love from those stories. Lucy, because of her innocent exploration of Narnia and her longing to help her family and to be understood by her family. And then Mr. Tumnus, who recognizes that in her and recognizes the innocence in her right from the start, and that causes him to have like a total change of heart and really become a totally different fawn than he was before, just based on a short time meeting with her. And while he disappears for much of the story after that, the impression that Lucy leaves on him, it shows that any of us could leave an impression like that on somebody and change their life in a way that we never could have imagined in a short meeting with anybody that we meet in our lives, as well as how we can be for other people as Lucy is. I guess we'll go right along the line. We'll go right over to Crystal to see what her favorite characters are.
I think the default one for me is Aslan, first off. I think as someone who has come to this story later, and later in life, it was really nice to read the story and sort of see a lot of the symbolic elements with a fresh pair of eyes. And even though Aslan, we don't really see a lot of him in the book, I think we sense him, and we sort of sense the peace that he brings and the strength that he brings to the kids. And my second favorite one would also be Lucy. I have to agree with Paul here. Lucy is the embodiment of what I hope to be. Someone who suspends disbelief at all times, who says, yeah, I can open that wardrobe and there's going to be a forest in there. There's some sense of wonder that I think is so great. Lewis talks about recapturing, your youth, and that he mentions that he disposed of the being very grown up, the habit of being very grown up, and writes these stories through a child's eyes. It's fascinating stuff, and I think Lucy is where I think I would love to be spiritually, and imagine, I don't know how to say that, imaginarily, I don't know how to say that, like artistically, I don't know, it's like create, she just brings her innocence, and it's, to me, is just a really great aspect.
Dr. Edwards.
Well, let me say Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, because they are our window into the first inkling we have of Aslan and who he is, that he's not safe, but good. And I think that's one of the most stirring lines of literature of any kind I've ever read. And I say that as somebody who did not read Narnia until later in adulthood, and later than even my acquaintance with Lewis's general canon. I was badgered, if you will, into reading Narnia by my wife, Joan, because I said, I'll get to that, but I'm more interested in getting through Lewis's literary criticism and so on and so forth. So I had this very highfalutin expectation of what I was going to write about. And that line, not safe but good, is startling. It is dynamic, and it just cuts right through me every time. And no matter if it's in the voice of I was trying to think of the actor who plays him in the Narnia movie, and so I've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe hundreds of times now. I've taught it, but that line always brings tears to my eyes, and I really hardly can go on after I get to that point. And yet, that's just the beginning. And so Aslan, to me, is an inexhaustible character for us to think about.
Indeed. And that was Ray Winstone.
Yeah, Ray Winstone.
Yes, very, very good rendition of Mr. Beaver. And we'll go right back over to William O'Flaherty.
I as well didn't read these stories until later in life, not quite probably as late as Bruce, who was just commenting, but I did it towards my late teens in either 11th or 12th grade. I actually don't remember. which year it was, but I picked out, as Lewis once said about the screw tape letters, someone picked it because it was the shortest. I was in an English class that wasn't too competitive or college prep, although I did ultimately go into college. And so I picked The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a book to read, and I, of course, enjoyed it quite well. The characters that stood out to me were the traditional Aslan, because of the strong characteristics there. But now, he wasn't a person, so although I enjoyed it and I saw some of the Christian symbolism because I was a Christian at that time, I felt or was more drawn towards Peter, who obviously really shows the strong presence, being the oldest child. I'm the only male in my family, don't have any brothers, but and I'm the youngest, so as him being the opposite, the oldest, I kind of wish maybe I was that type of person. And so his character was my other favorite. Now, since that time, I'll just share briefly, I've learned to enjoy or appreciate the character of Edmund in this story because he was first a traitor. He did things that really, hurt other people. And I know I can do that unintentionally. The change in his life that shows that there is hope for change no matter, what you've done, even if you're a traitor. So I've learned to appreciate that character more. Our next segment is unique to this story, which we're going to look at for each in the series of books. So, Bruce, tell us about, this is, of course, the first published book, so there's a lot of unique aspects to it that maybe could lend itself to a lot of information, but this is sort of the source text because it was the first published one for the rest of the tales. What aspects stand out to you as being unique to this story? What elements?
Well, let's think first about Lewis's history, meaning his childhood reading, which was filled with what we consider children's literature classics, especially a writer by the name of E. Nesbit. Lewis's affection for E. Nesbit and one of her books, The Railway Children, which is sort of a pattern or a template for what happens in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What he really loved about that work was not only the setting and the playfulness of the narrative, but it's that even though this is written for children, it was not written from an adult point of view. It wasn't written to talk down or to be condescending toward children. And if you have a sense of what children's literature was like in the 40s and 50s, both in Britain and America, you realize that what Lewis is really doing is quite unique in taking children seriously and speaking to them as peers, so to speak. And that's one of the things that Lewis loved about Tolkien and other authors that they shared in common in terms of the audience. And so that is a unique aspect of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that carries through in the narrator's voice throughout the seven chronicles. And I think that stands out to me as something that only Lewis was cognizant of and doing in this period of time. Now, since then, what Lewis does and what he achieves in Narnia might seem commonplace, but at the time he began his series, based upon his images and based upon his dreams and visions and so forth, few adult writers for children's literature would have taken this dare. And so I appreciate that about Lewis. And the narrative, The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, the way I would describe it when I first read it as an adult in my mid-20s was it just takes you by surprise. And I think that's a common element as the story moves forward. And one of the things that is most important to note is something Lewis said about his adaptation of the fairy tale for this particular set of stories. And I'll just read a bit of what Lewis says. I wrote fairy tales because the fairy tale seemed the ideal form for the stuff I had to say. And I just love it that this erudite writer, C.S. Lewis, uses the word stuff, because we use the word stuff, of course. And he connects this to his childhood inability to feel the pain and the suffering of Jesus on the cross. He said it's that Sunday school image. And so he had the idea as an adult Christian return to his faith, why not strip this stained glass Sunday school associations, and I'm quoting now, what if one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency? Could one thus not steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. Of course, that phrase, steal past watchful dragons, is very famous for those who know the background of Lewis. And it's the name of an early book on Narnia by Walter Hooper. And the thing I want to underscore there is simply that this marriage of the fairy tale form with children's literature, with these large themes about the resurrection and the redemption of Narnia in the life of Aslan, is monumental in just sort of shaking the foundations of Christian literature, and certainly in terms of children's literature for all ages.
Now we come to the segment called General Discussion, for lack of a fancier title. That is where we don't hope to exhaustively look at the book, because it would take a long series of podcasts for each book in and of itself. But we want to hit some different aspects that we hope will cut across the listenership here, from people that are very familiar with Lewis to those who are maybe just getting into reading the Chronicles of Narnia, or haven't maybe even finished it. For the first question, let's dovetail, so to speak, to the comment about past watchful dragons, kind of a setup here, and that is, Lewis freely uses the element of magic in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is considered by many to be like a pagan element. Surely Lewis should have known that he should have used something more Christian than this. Bruce, first let's have you comment about that. So what do you think was going on here, and why did Lewis feel so free to use magic?
Well, I hope, William, while you were even saying that out loud, you were putting air quotes around that Christian, because I think what the Chronicles of Narnia as a whole, and certainly Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe represent, is something that comes from Lewis's own conversion experience or reconversion experience. And he felt that pagan was not necessarily an epithet. It was not necessarily a negative, because essentially what Lewis believed is that paganism, with its range of stories and characters and heroic and iconic characters that we still use and still explore in movies and books, was sort of God's good dreams for those who had not come to Christ. And so when he uses so-called pagan elements, he's really speaking from the vocabulary of his youth, his adulthood, and he's building a story around those common elements that would register with a wide range of cultural experiences. And, of course, one of the things that Tolkien found objectionable about some of the Narnian Chronicles, maybe all of them, is that it wasn't kind of a pure mythology. Well, that's not the sort of person Lewis is. He is very eclectic, and he finds common ground and common glory, if you will, in lots of different sorts of stories, all of which eventually are subsumed under the supreme story of Aslan, or in this case, we know he represents Christ. So I don't think it's foreign territory for the telling of this story, and certainly not for Lewis, to use magic.
I actually came up with that question, and one of the things that I thought about in terms of trying to reconcile, so to speak, because of the background of my Christian faith, is magic to some extent is something that is beyond the natural, or it would be per se supernatural. So the use of magic is a supernatural element that, since this story is in a mythological world, that it would be perfectly appropriate for him to say magic as opposed to, a supernatural power. And so that's how I've reconciled that aspect of it. But I really like the way Bruce talked about that. That was very helpful. Thanks, Bruce. You mentioned about Tolkien's thoughts about Lewis's work. I wonder if you can maybe draw more out of that, and then actually we're going to address the broader issue of, what accounts for the difference between Lewis obviously felt very good about his stories, and Tolkien is known to not really like it. What was going on there?
In Lewis and Tolkien, we have two great friends who share a common love of mythology, but not necessarily a common understanding of how best to create or extend or interpret what those mythological traditions call for. And I think the ease with which Lewis drew upon his childhood and later adulthood associations with this eclectic mythology, for instance, even his friendship with another of the Inklings, another friend of a friend, so to speak, Charles Williams, how you could take a story like That Hideous Strength, one of the three of the cosmic trilogy, and marry Arthurian tradition, talking animals, and so on and so forth. That was disruptive to Tolkien's sense of continuity and so forth. And so when the seven Narnian Chronicles come out, they represent, a very personalized view of how mythology can be used in narrative and how it relates to audiences and so on and so forth, obviously to the delight of many children. But for Tolkien, who is a very serious, encyclopedic narrator of a single tradition, and unlike Lewis, Tolkien must have this elaborated, fully realized secondary world. And we all know now, in retrospect, that, as things continue to be published of dictionaries and maps and other kinds of creative efforts that Tolkien has given us, that's not Lewis's methodology, it's not his style, and it's not the way he composes. And I've heard Tolkien called a completist, or we might even say encyclopedist. That's not Lewis. Lewis is close to the vest in some ways, but he's also very open and gives us the stories that are just beneath the surface, filled with interesting connections, but it's going to be told in a lighthearted way and be presented to the audience that he's targeted, in this case with the fairy tale. So two different authors, friends, but different traditions represented. Lewis, so to speak, is an evangelist. Tolkien is a philologist. And they shared their faith, but they didn't share a common way to tell the kinds of stories that they both loved.
Paul, do you have any thoughts on this topic about Tolkien and Lewis?
I had heard somewhere that Tolkien didn't really like some of what Lewis had done with some of the mythological creatures, such as Mr. Tumnus, who, as a faun in his book, was not the sort of impish, very short in stature and kind of perverse type character that a faun in literature prior to Narnia would have been, and kind of saw it as a betrayal of pre-existing mythologies that included fauns. And I had heard that was kind of one of the things that put Tolkien off from even continuing to read Narnia from that point.
How about you, Crystal? Any thoughts about the Lewis and Tolkien differences about Narnia?
Sure. Sort of what Paul said, very similar to what he said. I feel like Tolkien was more sort of creating his own mythology, so he made the rules. He made hobbits, so he could tell you they had furry feet and they eat, multiple meals a day. With Lewis, I think he rested on using, mythology that was already established. And I know that, a lot of people have read that Tolkien was opposed to using Father Christmas in Narnia, and that was, he just thought that was kind of bizarre because that's sort of a mixture of all these different mythologies. But I think Lewis was smart in that he was using these things that would be relatable to children, that they would recognize. And so he already had that established with his readership when he published the book.
Next, I'd like us to consider the impact The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Narnia series had on Lewis's later life. Bruce, can you share your thoughts on that?
I think most of us would be aware that even though Lewis hoped this work would be successful, he would never have imagined how popular it would become in his lifetime, and certainly 30 years later, how majestically it would bring Lewis to the forefront in cinema with at least one of the first Narnian movies made. And even with the reception he got, which was very positive, he couldn't have imagined how this was liberating and brought to his composition of freedom that I mentioned earlier, allowing him to write about the Psalms and reflection of the Psalms, allowing him to write about the four loves and most importantly, the work that he considered his masterpiece, although he originally thought of Perelandra in that way, Till We Have Faces, which is his great retelling of the Cupid Psyche myth. I believe it's both the success of Narnia from a reader's point of view and also success from a publishing point of view that gives Lewis the impetus and sort of the final push to do the things he'd always wanted to do. He's no longer the polemicist. He's no longer the Socratic interrogator of popular culture. He's done that work, and it hasn't really been surpassed. And so I think Narnia really presents Lewis with the stage upon which he can complete the rest of his career with, of course, some help and encouragement from Joy Davidman Gresham.
What I think about Lewis, what I really love about Lewis is that he's such a unique writer. There are a lot of great writers, but there are a few that we can actually mature into as readers. And Lewis is one of those great writers that we can read as a child, escape into Narnia as a child, and then as we grow spiritually, intellectually, he follows us. He remains our guide through those. And I think that's such a fascinating aspect about Lewis.
Well, as we mentioned, obviously, we're not going to get to a complete discussion of the book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which wasn't our purpose, but to look at some various aspects. And to add to some of what was just shared, the question on the table now is the ongoing discovery of Lewis by new and old that is not slowing down.
The remarkable thing about Lewis to me is he continues to stay in print. Not only one aspect of his writing, his apologetics or his literary criticism or his science fiction, his fantasy, it's all out there, including some of the more obscure pieces that have been collected. He's in print. He's in print in many different languages, and he continues to be discovered by earnest souls who are looking for some moral sanity, some compass for guiding them through what is increasingly a bewildering world. And I hear from students and critics and people just interested in learning more about Lewis every day from China and India and Southeast Asia. We heard earlier from Paul. Indonesia is a place that his website has great prominence. And I think it's just incredible that Lewis could still be a kind of newbie, a kind of new discovery on different continents. And I think it's a testimony to the richness of his work and the fact that his original work is still original in the best sense of that and continues to compel readers to want to hear more about him.
Yeah, and definitely because when each of the films came out, I know that HarperCollins saw a staggering increase in book sales for Lewis's works. And the most amazing thing about that is the ones that got the highest sales weren't the Narnia books per se, but while those did have an increase, it was everything else that Lewis wrote had a much higher, more dramatic increase than even his Narnia books when the Narnia films were released. So score one for HarperCollins, but score one for the fans of Lewis that are now growing thanks to, in part, the films coming out.
I think Lewis, one thing that I love about him is that he is relevant, and the themes, the ideas, they're all still very relevant. And for me, my discovery was very similar to going through a wardrobe, because I had never read, even as an English major in college, I'd never read anything that was what I would consider intellectually Christian. And when I discovered Lewis, I discovered Chesterton, and I discovered Tolkien, and I discovered MacDonald. So there was this whole new world of this blending of faith and intellect and imagination that was just phenomenal for me. It was life changing. So Lewis and everything he wrote, the whole of it, science fiction, children's literary criticism, apologetics, all that stuff, I think is still very relevant and holds true today. So I think there are many of us out there that are still discovering Lewis because of those truths. They still hold true today.
And for me, my comment in this section sort of relates to something that I was considered as a potential question, but it didn't make the cut, so to speak, and that is, when you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and when I was going back over it in preparation for this podcast, one of the things that I was thinking about or noticing more so was how Lewis was able to naturally fit in hidden lessons, things that he maybe didn't necessarily think about consciously, but it just came out as an outgrowth because it flowed in the story, and because he was a Christian, there was a moral element to it, or sort of a hidden lesson. Things like Turkish delight, too much of a bad thing. There was nothing wrong with Edmund eating Turkish delight, but if he ate too much of it, there was going to be some problems. Or always winter but never Christmas. It's nice to have snow, but if you live in an area that it's always snow, then you kind of wish maybe there might be a real spring. So that's just a couple of things that stood out in my mind in passing about Lewis, and how he was able to bring in that moral. In fact, he did write a essay related to this on 3 ways of writing for children, and I believe that came out during the time when these books were being published. It wasn't even afterwards, because within that essay he notes that he wouldn't put himself in the place as an expert on writing children's story, and he was giving some various comments that are very helpful, but it wasn't about how to write a children's story. And yet, even though he didn't have that purpose, that it was a very interesting essay. In fact, on my website, essentialcslewis.com, if it's not already posted, I'll be having a essay chat with an individual about that very essay. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this debut program for the podcast series on the Chronicles of Narnia. As we warned you, we weren't trying to have an exhaustive look at this book, but just wanted to, take a look at certain aspects. To do a complete study maybe would take almost 7 podcasts for each book.
I hope you enjoyed this from the Archives program that was recorded back in 2013. The remaining 6 shows will be released in the near future. Again, I'm William O'Flaherty from EssentialCSLewis.com. I'm the author of 3 books. The most recent is entitled The Screwtape Letters Handbook, the easiest guide to help you get the most out of Lewis's classic book. Another website I created is AdultAutismWithWilliam.com, where I focus primarily on living with level 1 autism as an adult. Additionally, I'm the co-host of the Chatty Aldi Show. You can find links to everything I just mentioned in the description, along with links to things related to Paul Martin from NarniaFans.com and Dr. Crystal Hurd, who has a YouTube channel called That Lewis Lady. Thanks again for listening. Please consider liking and sharing this episode and subscribing to my channel if you haven't already.